So this is the 8th video in the chapter on sociological perspective, the first chapter in the sociology class. And in this lecture, I want to apply sociological theory to the phenomena, to the social fact of divorce, and hopefully set you up so that you can do the next activity yourself. So again, going back to the role of theory, the purpose, the role, the function of theory is to describe, to explain patterns. And we have the three theories. So we have the two macro theories, conflict and functional theory, and then we have a micro theory, symbolic interactionism. And so by way sort of illustration, how these theories work is I want to talk about the pattern, the social fact of divorce. Currently, so we were all together, I might ask you, why do you think people get divorced? And I would get lots of different answers. People would say things like people fall out of love, argue over money, lack of communication, and all of these things certainly have a part in explaining why people get divorced. But I want to invite you to consider the role of theory, or consider theoretical explanations for divorce. Right? So here's the thing, is that we know the social fact, the pattern is that almost half of marriages end in divorce. Matter of fact, the median duration of a marriage, which means the point at which half of marriages have ended and half have not, is about 12 years. So if you have gotten to your 12th year of marriage, you've outlasted half of American marriages. That's for first marriages. Second marriages actually don't even last that long. Half of second marriages are over by the time that they get to their 7th year. So clearly divorce is a fairly common thing. And it is more common today in 2021 than it was in the 1960s. Somewhere around the 70s or the 80s, we saw a pretty big increase in divorce. And that's where we get the half or the 50%. And I could talk about how that's not exactly the proper definition, but about half of, and the way that we arrive at that statistic is statisticians look at the number of, I need to set my alarms, I need to set my timer, at the number of marriage licenses granted in a community, and they compare that to the number of divorce petitions. And generally it'll be about 100. I'm just making these numbers up, but there might be 100 marriages and maybe 45 divorces. And some places have higher divorce rates. For instance, Riley County, where I live, actually has a really low divorce rate. Right? We have a high marriage rate. There's a lot of folks that get married in Riley County, but they move away to get divorced. We've got a lot of college kids and we've got a lot of military. So anyway, these are the social facts. These are some of the patterns. But how do we explain that? Is this, and I would suggest, so let's start with, let's just go sort of in order. Functional theory would argue that divorce, first of all, we have to assume that we think divorce is bad, right? That divorce, the fact that more people divorce today than before, suggests that something has changed and suggests that maybe something in the social structure has changed. And particularly a functionalist might look to how family life has changed, because obviously divorce is a function of the family, right? As it's a phenomena, a family relationship. So what's happened in marriages or in families that would have changed, that would have explained this? It might also note that some of the laws have changed. Specifically, from a functionalist perspective, you want to point out that in the 1980s, the laws were liberalized, and we had something called no-fault divorce. So for the first time, you could get divorced and not have to say why, irreconcilable differences. So functional theory might also suggest, or might also observe, that another difference is that in family life, once upon a time, you're kind of like the Durkheim video, once upon a time, everything happened in your family. You were born in your family household, you died in your family household, your parents arranged your marriages in family households, you got a trade, you got your religion, you got your training, but that's no longer the case. right? Today, all of that stuff happens someplace else. So a functionalist might argue that this may be that the role of marriage, it's no longer stigmatized to have sex outside of marriage, right? It's no longer, we have something called, so the function, what families and marriages used to do, we don't really need families anymore, right? All of those things can be done someplace else. So from a functionalist perspective, divorce is a phenomena, if you will, maybe of that, I don't want to say the sanctity of the family has changed, but certainly its purpose, it's no longer the central function or the central primary social group anymore. Now it's peers or work or sports teams, right? So from a functionalist perspective, if I want to change divorce, I might make families more important and more central, right? Conflict theory, on the other hand, right? Conflict theory might make similar observations, might notice how laws have changed, but from a conflict theorist perspective, that what is happening, or would certainly look at societal changes, and a conflict theorist would notice that indeed it is easier to get divorced, but that's because women have more power than they used to have, right? And in fact, that is true. Today, 2/3 of divorces are initiated by women. So a conflict theorist would point to maybe changes in divorce laws, maybe changes in domestic violence laws, and see that as a societal shift in the distribution of power between men and women. It's also true that women make a little bit more money than we used to in the 70s. It is still true that we don't make as much as men do per dollar, but they would observe that divorce is really a phenomena of shifting power, between men and women in larger societies, and in the larger societies, but also collectively between husband and wife, right? No longer are women expected to obey their husband. No longer are women expected to surrender all their property to their husband. So divorce, they would see it as maybe a reconciling, if you will, of the distribution of power between men and women in society. So this is simply a reflection of women gaining their relative power. Now, those are both macro, right? Those are both macro. And from a conflict theorist perspective, if this was my explanation for divorce, well, then I needed to make it hard. Then I needed to maybe make it harder for women to have so much power, right? I needed to reconcile or rebalance those power distributions between men and women, and men needed we needed to go back to the way things were, so that women didn't have the same sort of power differential, or they were back to sort of some old previous distributions. Now, what's interesting when I ask a class this question is almost always the responses are fit more under the umbrella of the third theory, which is symbolic interactionism. When we say things like, well, they fall out of love. What is love? Love is a symbolic thing. Love is a concept that we understand, right? You can't see love. You can't measure love. It's an idea. So when we say people fail to communicate, well, what exactly does that mean? Communication is explaining ideas back and forth. Communication is inherently about interacting symbolically through language, right? So most of the time, our explanation, our understanding of the causes of divorce are at a micro level, right? But we could also, this is where this theory can be kind of useful in that we can apply it on a larger scale. One could also make an argument that culturally, what marriage used to mean is different, right? Marriage used to mean till death did you part, and divorce used to be highly stigmatized, which is a symbol, right? Now divorce has a different meaning. It's no longer symbolically what it used to be. Love, romantic love is the thing. And when you fall out of romantic love, right? Once upon a time, you got married and then you loved your partner. Romantic love, going back to Victorian times, love had nothing to do with marriage, right? Love was a distraction. You would never think lustfully and sexually about your wife, about the mother of your children, as you would your concubine. Oh my gosh, right? You would never mix those two things up. But now we put so much pressure on what love is. You're supposed to love sexually. You're supposed to love, like, I mean, all of that one relationship. That's supposed to be so much. And so, in essence, the meaning of what marriage used to be, which was a place where people came together to pool their resources to raise the next generation, now it's supposed to be about positive feelings and be nice to each other and fun, right? And when it's not, then we decide that the marriage is over, right? Or once upon a time, marriage had a different meaning. So I might ask you, if you were in the same room, which one of these is the most true? I mean, it's certainly true that marriage and family, you can be a fully functioning person in society and never get married, right? And it's also true that women continue to file 2/3 of divorces, and that the laws around divorce have changed, and that marriages are slightly more equitable in 2021 than they were in the 1960s. It's also true that divorce is less stigmatized and that romantic love continues to dominate. So which one of these is the best theory? Well, I'd argue none of them. All of them work together. But my question to you would be, and maybe I will put that in a question, which theory do you like the best? Which theory makes the most sense to you? Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and in the next activity, I'm going to give you a couple facts, and I'm going to ask you to try to explain those facts and identify the theory that you're using. All right, and I think this is going to wrap up this chapter, so I will see you in chapter 2.